and I will ask it for you. So we'll start straight away with Anna Susarova, who will talk about the legal restriction for import and export during COVID-19 in Belgium and Russia and in other CIS countries, and perspectives for relaxation of rules in near future. So Anna, thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for connecting today, and many thanks to Belgian Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce to organize this webinar. I'd like to quickly introduce myself. So I'm Anna Susarova, managing partner at law firm Bravolex. We are Belgian law firm with specificity of Russian-speaking lawyers and lawyers with both Belgian and Russian diploma in practice. My goal today is to help you understand legal challenges during the COVID crisis and challenges in doing business in Eurasian Economic Union region. And I will focus on Belgian, Russian, and Kazakh markets. Manon, would you put... Yes, thank you. Sorry. You can go to the next slide. Let's first start with the region of 5 countries, which are members of Eurasian Economic Union. Like European Union, Eurasian Economic Union adopted common trade rules inside its borders and common import-export rules for this region. So 5 countries are members of this union: Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia. They all have following harmonized new rules for pandemic crisis period. Next slide. First of all, Eurasian Economic Union introduced a temporary ban on the export of medical related goods, such as personal protective equipment, protective devices, and disinfectants products for medical use. The temporary ban has been in place since April and will remain in place through the end of September. Next slide. Next measures at the Eurasian Economic Union level are the following. Certain types of goods of food in high demand during times of crisis have been added to the list of goods deemed essentially important for the domestic market of the Eurasian Economic Union. So temporary bans or quantitative restrictions on export were allowed for introduction of several types of goods. The list of banned export goods has been extended. For instance, it touches onion, garlic, turnips, and other products that you can see on my PowerPoint presentation. The ban took effect from April and remained in place through the end of June, inclusive. Yesterday, I checked on the Eurasian Union website whether the application period of restrictive measures have been extended, and I did not find any information, so unless I'm mistaken, these limitations are no longer in effect. And the last measure, important measure at the Eurasian level, next slide please, it's the suspension of import duties for specific medical related goods, such as personal protective equipment and materials for the manufacture of such equipment, antiviral disinfectants, etc. The suspension of tariffs will apply to goods cleared and declared from March through September of this year. Next slide, please. Let's now focus on Russian market. The Russian government has suspended, under some circumstances, VAT on the importation and sale of such goods as COVID test kits, face masks, respirators, air filtration and purification equipment, ventilators, medicine devices to treat COVID. Suspension of VAT applies in case these goods are imported for free circulation, but must be intended only for the free of charge transfer to organizations operating in healthcare. So, to get the VAT relief on declaring such goods, the importer must produce confirmation of their intended use, issued by a regional government authority, containing information where the goods will be used. These documents should confirm that goods will be delivered to a healthcare organization free of charge. The relief in question covers relationships that arose from March and will remain in place through the end of September. So what about import, export activity and transport? Now, the most preferred types of cargo transportation are container transport by rail or by sea. Because they do not plan to close ports and transport branches, and the terms and tariffs in these types of transportation do not change so critically. Car transportation is not so good for the moment. Road transport now has a large number of restrictions and additional requirements for transportation, handling, etc. For instance, there are limitations on foreign transport employees' presence in Russia. In Russian Federation, carriers must minimize contacts of foreign and Russian drivers arriving from abroad. If a driver needs to stay in Russia for a while, the company must ensure that his self-isolation. And in addition, he must provide his drivers with personal protective equipment and personal hygiene products. So it increases a lot of costs. At this moment, it's better to opt for transport by sea or rail. Other important point in Russia, to facilitate import-export activities, Ministry of Industry and Trade of Russia issue electronic license for the export or import of certain types of goods through its Gosuslug portal that I put on my PowerPoint or on the portal support of foreign trade participants that you can all see now on the PowerPoint. And what about limitation on export or import? As I said before, limitation or ban on export were introduced at the Eurasian Economic Union level. Import of several medical devices was facilitated at the same level. Specifically in Russia, they simplified procedures for state registration of medical devices. Simplified procedure applies for 36 types of medical devices. You can find in-depth information about it on the website you can see on the PowerPoint. Another thing to mention on importation or exportation activities is the fact that COVID has changed demand on several products in Russia. There are new potential niches for increasing import and export activity. For instance, engineering and chemical industry show growing interest from importers. Additional demand for polymer packaging reappeared. despite the trend before the epidemic crisis to replace polymer packaging by ecological one. There is also growing demand for protective clothing made of polymers, as well as for detergents. Another promising area is the field of metallurgy. For example, there is a jump in demand for gold from countries that hold American debt securities. In the context of the spread of food delivery, medical devices, and the need for medical waste disposal, today there is an increased demand for packaging paper, for sanitary paper and production of medical furniture. There is also high demand for mobile hospitals. There are all new opportunities in Russian market, and I invite all companies to consider it. And what about travel to Russian Federation? All people who have returned from China, Iran, South Korea, USA, Great Britain, European Union, Ukraine, Belarus shall stay, unfortunately, in quarantine for 2 weeks. During this time, employers are not allowed to allow people from these countries to work. Everyone who lives in the same apartment with arrivals from these countries should observe quarantine, and during this period you must stay at home even if there are no symptoms of the disease. Next slide, please. So, having looked at the measures taken in Russia, I would like also present another important country in the Eurasian Economic Region, which is Kazakhstan. On this slide, you can have an overview of different implemented measures during the COVID crisis period. So, in March, the taxpayers classified as micro, small or medium-sized enterprise were granted a deferred payment period for all taxes till June. On April, a ban on export from the territory of Kazakhstan for certain products was introduced, like sugar, potatoes, sunflower seeds, sunflower oil, etc. Also, they introduced quantitative restrictions for export of certain goods from Kazakhstan, like wheat flour, raw sunflower oil and primary packages. At the border, they enlarge green corridors. It means that there is an exemption from applying forms of customs control during clearance for certain goods. And they, on the other hand, they reduced red and yellow channels at the border for other products. What is important to mention is that VAT was reduced from 12% to 8% for imports of goods included in the list I spoke about before at the Eurasian Economic Union level. To help import-export activity, on-site customs inspections scheduled have been cancelled. And there are several tax measures to support economy, like property tax rate 0 for legal entities, land tax rate 0 for agricultural land, individual income tax rate 0 for individual entrepreneur, and export customs duty rate 0 until the end of this year for exported light oil products. So it was an overview of Kazakhstan, and on the next slides I will explain you about European Union measures. So as everybody heard, as from 1st July, European Union authorized its member states to lift restrictions on non-essential travel into European Union for residents of the following countries. You can show the next slide. So you can see Morocco, Algeria, Georgia, Montenegro, etc. Residents of Andorra, Monaco, San Marino, Vatican, they are considered also as European Union residents. They can also travel. More information and actualization of this information is provided on the website of Europe that I put in my previous slide. Yes, you have the website on to check which countries are open or not. What about transportation rules in Europe? The transport of goods can continue without limitation, and European Commission set up green lanes to facilitate the transport of goods. Are there limitations for export? In April, European Commission made exportation of individual protective devices subject to export authorization, but this limitation is not longer applicable since May 25. Customs issues related to the COVID emergency on the European customs are presented in depth on the website I put in my PowerPoint that you can see. You can find on this website updated information about different customs facilities during COVID crisis. And the last thing at the European Union level, unfortunately, they extended sanctions targeting exchanges with Russia until the end of January. So these restrictive measures, as we know, limit access to European Union primary and secondary capital markets for certain Russian banks. They impose an export and import ban on trade in arms. And it's established an export ban for dual-use goods for military use or military end users in Russia. So it was an overview about European rules. Now let us focus on Belgium. Next slide, please. What are the Belgian specificities? In Belgium, you are allowed to move around freely. Except in public transport, you must wear a face mask. Outside Belgium, as authorities are now considering reopening its borders to the countries that European Union authorized. But Belgian authorities will announce after July 7th if and under which conditions travels to these countries will be allowed. Moreover, there are two important things to mention. First, Belgium authorizes essential journeys for 4 categories. Mariners, persons attending meetings of international organizations, students, and highly qualified personnel whose work cannot be carried out at distance. Second point is that third country nationals with legal residence in European Union, as well as their family members, can travel wherever they wish inside European Union, including Belgium, and they don't need to stay in their country of residence, so they can travel now freely through Europe. So, for instance, Russian citizens with Belgian residence permit can travel through Europe freely. Next slide, please. To limit economic impact of coronavirus on business, federal and regional authorities have announced a series of measures, like in all countries. I put on this website, on this slide, several websites of regions where you can find in-depth information about economic and financial incentive for Belgian companies. Next slide, please. I would like to focus on legal protections that were introduced for COVID crisis in Belgium. These legal protections interest all companies. First issue that they tried to solve, it's the problem related to bad payers. Unfortunately, the crisis has led to a growth in defaults of payment of invoices. To protect companies in financial difficulties, Belgian government introduced temporary legal moratorium. During this period, no legal actions were allowed, except urgent cases. Was also introduced a general interdiction for insolvency actions against debtors, except the power for public prosecutor to engage such actions. We also had a general interdiction for seizure measures against Belgian debtors. For instance, if a Belgian company do not pay its invoices, it was impossible to seize its bank account during the COVID crisis. This legal moratorium is not applicable anymore since the end of June, but there's still other legal measures to help companies to recover from the crisis, such as postponement of shareholders' meetings. For instance, shareholder meetings for approval of annual accounts can be postponed by 10 weeks, so annual accounts may be published with delay without sanctions. What are other legal facilities you can use for the moment? Next slide, please. Let me give you a very, very nice tip to help your company overcome difficulties in performing contracts. So frequent problems we met at this time is difficulties to perform contractual obligations. A nice legal tip you can use is called force majeure. Let's start with an example. In March, you sign a contract for exportation from Belgium to Russia of medical devices. In April, European Union suddenly introduced an exportation authorization for these devices, and your company is unable to export or must postpone delivery. Question: can you free yourself from your contract without penalties? Yes, you can invoke the magic of force majeure. What is it, force majeure? It's an unforeseeable event occurring after the conclusion of the contract, which makes it impossible to perform. So, force majeure constitutes a discharge for the debtor. It means that force majeure prevents the contracting party from being considered responsible for breach of the contract or for not fulfillment of its obligation. So, question: coronavirus or government measures are a kind of force majeure. So, coronavirus itself can probably never be considered as force majeure. In fact, the coronavirus in itself does not make the execution of a contract, export contract for instance, impossible. But government decision that should be considered as force majeure. For instance, governments banned exportation for some products to other countries. These measures prevent some traders from export. Failure to export some devices by order of the government, of course, a contractor is exempted from supplying his products. For instance, if your company was unable to deliver products because of the government export ban, you can invoke force majeure and release yourself from the obligation to deliver. But if you did not deliver on time because of, for instance, a requirement to obtain an export license, you can also invoke force majeure. So that help you to avoid to pay penalties. However, if no limitation for export was introduced for your products, you cannot invoke force majeure because of, for instance, difficulties to organize transportation during these difficult times. In that case, it's better to negotiate with your contractor to avoid or reduce application of penalties and other contractual sanctions. So I have the 20 minutes, it's 24 minutes now. That's all I have to say for today webinar. Thank you all for your attention. Now I'm happy to answer or later any question you might have.
Thank you, Anna. I think we'll keep the questions, keep your questions in mind. We'll ask them at the end of all presentations, and I will now give the floor to Konstantin Mirovic, Adecco country manager in Russia. We'll talk about the current HR market situation and overview of trends in Russian labor law. Konstantin, you have the floor.
Thank you, Manan. Hello, everyone. So I will try to briefly touch the most important and critical points related to HR within this COVID-19 situation in Russia. Manan, would you please share my presentation? Next slide, please. Previous one. Yes, thank you. So then first I will touch labor market situation as for today. So the most impacted industries which are listed in the left red column are currently releasing their qualified resources, impacting overall employment rate. You can see the table on the slide. For your information, each % of unemployment rate means 750,000 of employable population. So if we see that from the very beginning of the crisis in February till May, over 1 million of employable population was released, according to official statistics. In May, over 2 million people applied for unemployment support to employment agency, compared to only 700,000 in May last year. Before the crisis, analytics assessed the ratio of people applying for support to the total unemployed people number as 3 to 10. So we can deduce based on these numbers that in June, we might forecast around 6.6 million people unemployed, which will constitute 8.8% of unemployment rate. This assessment might be inflated due to the fact that during the crisis, the government increased the unemployment welfare, and the ratio of people applying for unemployment support increased compared to the situation before the crisis. BCG forecasts that in case of the second wave of pandemic, the unemployment rate in Russia will rise to 8 to 10%, leading to the purchasing power of decrease at 4 to 6%. So historically, unemployment in Russia is restricted by the practice of Russian management and Russian business to reduce the number of hours or wages instead of hard staff reductions. This approach is possible due to the large proportion of salaries variable part in total compensation amount. At the current situation, the number of released employees is growing in the following sectors. It's entertainment, like sports, art, hotels, restaurants lost around over 50% in sales compared to May last year. Retail also lost, though product retail lost only 1.5% in sales compared to May 2019, though non-product retail lost over 10% in sales compared to the same month last year. Some retailers, like fashion retailers, went even further down, and for example, travel, like international tourism, just plummeted during this crisis. So what we expect is that the personal optimization will continue during this summer. What we see as an agency that the number of top management of small and medium companies is increasing on the market. When the purchasing power of population is going down, niche players, like they are mainly small and medium companies, are closing down, releasing the resources. So we see a lot of country managers, sales, and HR specialists are now free on the market. What we can say that the production, which is mainly our clients, banks and mining industries, are still stable and continue with their projects. And we can notice that the rapid growth can be seen in delivery services and healthcare and pharma production and online trade. But I believe this is obvious. So what we see that we are still in the declining slope of the curve, and the recovery is dependent on the pandemic development. Nobody is sure whether or not there will be a second wave. Yep. So this is about the market. Could you please go to the next slide? So here I would touch the principal impact of COVID situation on HR legislation in Russia. So first of all, there were non-working days introduced. These are specific days newly to Russian labor code. They were imposed by presidential decree in March, from 23rd of March till May the 11th. And these days were neither holidays nor weekends. And during these days, the employers were required to keep their employees at home if possible and pay them in full, irrespective whether or not employees did their job. Of course, there were exclusions to this decree. It's like companies with full production cycle, like agricultural producers, medical and pharmacy companies, producers of food and first need products, and their contractors in supply chains, and some other organizations nominated by local authorities. So it was highly recommended by the government not to release personnel during these days. So the business was not allowed to put people on idle stay because of the corona situation. And the only reasons for people termination applicable were on employee discretion, by agreement of parties, and on temporary contract expiration. When this regime of non-working days was lifted off in May, the regions were allowed to continue with this regime at their own discretion. For example, Moscow started lifting off these limitations only starting May the 9th. As soon as the limitations are lifted, employees need to return back to offices, and government, Rostetrebnadzor, made their own recommendation how to equip the offices in order to keep employees safe at work. In Moscow, these recommendations were made mandatory to employers. So, and these recommendations include equipment of offices with sanitizers at entrances, daily wet cleaning of the common areas, and offices should not include more than one person per 10 square meters. Employer need to provide its employees, its workers, with masks, gloves, and sanitizers, and ensure the temperature measurement of people going to work or coming to work. And employer need to subject its employees, at least 10% of employees working in office, to COVID-19 tests on semi-monthly basis. On top of that, currently our government is working to improve remote work conditions in the labor code, because currently a person can work either remotely or in office, but the labor code does not imply working both remotely and from office, dependent on different conditions. So that is planned to be introduced now into the labor code. And starting beginning this year, all employees are free to choose whether they want to keep on their labor books kept at the employers, or they want to use electronic version of their labor books, so reducing the paperwork. And the last point here is that currently the work permits for foreigners are provided only in case a foreigner stays on Russian soil. So if a foreigner applies for work permit and goes abroad, if it's possible, it won't be provided. So to receive a work permit, a foreigner needs to stay or reside in Russia until he gets it. On average, today it takes 1.5 months to get a work permit. Could you please go to the next slide, please? Thank you. A brief overview of the support measures that were imposed during the COVID situation to businesses. So if we speak about state support, we need to separate the companies which are large and systemically important to the economy, companies from the most impacted industries, and the rest of the businesses or economy. The list of the systemically important companies is defined by the ministries on the federal and regional levels, and these companies are subject to weekly stress testing, monitoring, and reporting on their HR and financial situation. So they send the report to tax and labor authorities to ensure that they are stable. In return, these companies might receive concessional lending at their key refinancing rate. They also may apply to recover their for subsidies to recover their costs, and they may postpone payment of their taxes. Also, there is a moratorium on a bankruptcy for such companies, at least till October this year. When we speak about the companies from the most impacted industries, these companies, if they are small and medium enterprises, and these are the enterprises that are logged in a separate registry, they are subject also to concessional lending at a very good rate, 8.5%, and 2/3 of the credit is paid by the governmental or state-supported banks. Government supports such companies with co-financing of the wages of their employees, at least at the amount of the minimal wage. It's like 12,000 rubles. These companies are also allowed to postpone payment of their taxes except for VAT and social charges till October next year. And these companies are allowed to postpone payment for rent for the commercial properties till October this year. And they also secured from the bankruptcy and till October this year. Nobody knows actually what will happen in October when this bankruptcy moratorium is lifted, but we will see. As for the rest of the economy, government decreased social charges for small and medium businesses from 30 to 15%. This is very good improvement of the taxation burden for the business. Also, government allowed to postpone rental payments for municipal property till next year and try to decrease red tape and admin burden on the businesses by automatically extending expired licenses, cancelling of planned inspections, but it actually doesn't help. Inspectors call and make their inquiries still a lot of time, so it doesn't help. And the government tried to simplify many procedures, namely import procedure for first need products. Would you please go to the next slide? Apart from the governmental support measures, all businesses consider how to support themselves. So what we can advise businesses here from a HR perspective is to take care of the HR related costs. And on the slide, I listed the actions to take in order of their complexity increase from top to bottom. So when you need to optimize your cost structure, first what we advise you to do is to freeze all the recruitment, freeze the travel and salary increases, and cancel all field development activities which are not mandatory. If your organization is large enough, only recruitment freeze will give you a lot of savings. Like, for example, I know IKEA did this year. They just canceled the recruitment and made a lot of savings in the HR budget just because of the natural turnover of the employees. If you have any incentives specified not in labor contracts with your employees, but in some local regulatory acts, incentives like food or travel allowances, you can change these incentives by changing these acts. You don't need to notify your employees in advance. If it's not enough, you need to talk to your employees and persuade them to start working part-time. By doing this, you will save your expertise and limit your costs on resources. If you reach mutual consent, you just add a supplement to the labor contract with your employees. If not, you need to notify your employees 2 months in advance to put this change in force. If your business is put on hold due to supply chain restrictions, closed borders, or any other sanctions, so you need to put your employees on idle state. So if this is due to your fault, I mean, it's your discretion. So you need to pay your employees 2/3 of their tariff, of their average employee earnings. I mean, this is salary, bonuses, and other stimulus you pay to your employees. If you need to do it for a reason independent of you, so then you need to pay your employees 2/3 of their tariff rate, base tariff rate. You put employees to idle stay by issuing a separate decree in your organization. If it doesn't help, the last and not least, you need to talk to your employees and agree mutually on their termination. In Russia, employees sometimes really appreciate this approach. They understand that it's better now to agree mutually on termination with the chance to be back to business when things goes better than to go on with the business and go down with the business without any chance to continue. So sometimes it's possible to persuade your employees that it's for the both parties good. And the last but very complicated approach is to kick off the redundancy procedure. The procedure is pretty complicated in Russia labor code. It requires 2 months notification. It requires payments of salaries during employees termination, and also respect of the order of termination, and can be challenged by employees in a court. So it has a lot of things to consider, so, and it should be the subject of a separate presentation. Actually, that is all from my side. Hopefully I got in time. Any questions, colleagues?
Thank you, Konstantin. I propose we go straight away, we continue with Igor Soldatov, and then we can ask a few questions to our speakers. So Igor, you have the floor, and you will talk about your experience in Husvinil.
Yes, good afternoon. I have 10 minutes. Probably part of my information will be already mentioned by Konstantin. So I am HR and Administrative Director of Rusvinyl, and on my first slide here you can see a photo of our plant, of our administrative building. I was also asked to prepare some information about HR trends in Russia and the impact of the situation with coronavirus. So let's go to the next slide. I want to start with a short story of Rusvinyl and our own practice in working on the COVID-19. Probably you know that Rusvinyl is a joint Russian-Belgian company that produce PVC, polyvinyl chloride. Rusvinyl is a leader in the market in this area. Currently, we have about 500 employees. Half of them are blue collars and other half are white collars. In the middle of March of this year, it became clear to our management that the threat of COVID is serious, and our company transferred 74 of our staff to remote work to home since 23rd of March. It was done in a few days. IT department prepared computers for remote work. HR prepared and signed all documents. So this process was organized very well. And only 1 week later, on 13th of March, Russian president declared days off for the whole country. From 8th of April, Rusvinyl went further in anti-COVID actions. As it was agreed with our shareholders, Rusvinyl has launched shift work with isolated production teams. We call it rotation shifts. It means that administration building was closed for our staff, and it was converted to hotel, real hotel. Each team consisted of 50 production employees and support employees from canteen, from cleaning, from IT, maintenance department. They worked at the plant and lived in this hotel as isolated during 2 weeks. After that, next team was tested on COVID, and then it substituted previous team, and it so on. That's why we call it rotation shift. So this operation mode lasted 2 months until 8th of June in our company. Thus, we overcame a peak of COVID in Nizhny Novgorod region, I hope. And it was interesting experience for us. At the moment, we are at the stage of stepwise return of employees from home offices. At the same time, we set rules that inside plant and offices can be present only those employees who has work which is directly related to equipment, to production, to maintenance and shipment. Now only 50% of our workplaces in the plant are occupied by employees, and moreover, they work in shift mode, change each other, so in order to decrease contacts. Next slide, please. Yes, on this slide, I will list the measures of safe work in the office that are now taken by our company. The measures actually are not unique. They are used by many companies in Russia and in the world. There are following rules: wearing masks in office, keeping social distance, keeping distance during transportation in buses, so only 25% of seats can be occupied in our buses, and we even have separate delivery for key group of employees from production in order to avoid COVID. Arrangement of safe working places, regular cleaning with disinfectants, testing for COVID-19, 15% of employees. Konstantin already mentioned such measure every 2 weeks. We also test our contractors, all our contractors from canteen, cleaning company, security, and bus transportation. Distant temperature measuring upon arrival at work at security gates, only one person at time in elevator. Avoid offline meetings with more than 2 participants, and external meetings, of course, no business trips. Canteen supplies our employees with packed business lunches. People with respiratory symptoms shall stay at home. Isolation of sick persons, track of their contacts if they present it at work, and then also isolate these contact persons. Distant work is encouraged. 10% of employees can be transferred on distant work even after COVID ends. So it's our expectation, and we are also actively encourage our partners to use electronic workflow in business processes to avoid necessity to work with a great lump of papers. Next slide, please. The situation, as I already said to Arkady, in Rusvinyl is not most typical for Russia. We did not face a decrease in demand of our products, a decrease in sales. Production is at full capacity. Nevertheless, due to general uncertainty and in the market and in agreement with our shareholders, we postponed or suspended the annual salary increases until Q3. We significantly reduced the budget for our trainings, and we agreed about hiring freeze. So it was also top 3 things which Konstantin mentioned. Now let me move to the from my company to HR trends. Recently, many reviews have been launched in our country, and they approximately give the same trends and dynamics, even if they are slightly different figures. I will share some statistics with you. This first diagram came from Association of European Business. On the left side, you see the answers to the question about dismissal of workers. 74 of respondents are trying to keep the staff on board so far. 17 had to send their staff on leave or reduce their work days, and 9 persons stated that they had to dismiss personnel. The right diagram shows the opinion of employers on the working hours of employees after pandemic. The majority, 63 of respondents, stated that they would have a more flexible schedule with the option to work from home, and up to 30 employees will continue to work remotely. Next slide, please. This slide shows the dynamics of companies' plans for recruitment. You can see here the clear trend that companies freezing hiring and postpone offers. It has logic, as 90% of companies, according to surveys in Russia, stated that their business was to some extent affected by the crisis. Next slide. Here we see how companies save on HR costs. The majority of companies will cut costs for corporate events and business trips for sure. Moreover, business trips will not recover to last year levels even after pandemic. It was the bottom lines of this slide. Next slide. This slide shows how the most popular actions of cost reduction which were applied to the staff. Of course, top management was affected by benefits, reduction of benefits and bonuses, and other staff was affected mainly by reduction of working hours, 4 days a week, probably 7 hours per day work, and so on. By the way, Rosweiland didn't use these options so far, and we hope that we will not need to do it. According to KPMG data, in total, 45% of companies decreased HR budget, and 10% increased this budget, and 35% left HR budget on the same level. Next slide, please. This slide will be on Russian. I will translate it. Slide came from the recruitment website headhunter.ru, that is most popular in Russia for recruitment. Here we see so-called stability index. It shows the mood of employees from different economic sectors, from -1, that means negative self-awareness, to +1, which is totally positive self-awareness. Top 3 most negative mood sectors are tourism, hotel, restaurant, purchasing, and marketing, plus PR, plus advertising. These sectors marked by red color. And on green color, top 3 sectors are those who begin their career, ex-students. The next one is mining sector, and science plus education. Next slide. Now this slide shows the dynamics of readiness of employees to lower own salary expectation. Red color shows people who are ready, green who are not ready, and gray is difficult to answer. So in Q2, those who are ready to lower their salary expectation are 11% more than on Q1 of this year. They are mainly located in Moscow and St. Pete region. People in Central region and Far East region feel themselves more confident. It was last slide regarding the HR market trends, and I hope now you can make your own impression on this topic. Next slide, the last slide, will be about some short summary about news of labor law legislation in Russia. Part of this news already mentioned by Konstantin. So we have new sick leave documents for people over 65 years old in order to let them be at home during pandemic. This is still valid now. Since next year, the personal income tax rate will be increased from 30% to 15% for the part of income over 5 million ruble per year. This decision is approved by government and president. Next thing is president has ordered to the government and regional authorities to take all necessary measures to fully restore the labor market already in the next year. It means that they should decrease unemployment rate. Test on COVID for foreigners since 27th of June this year will be obligatory condition for legal employment in Russia. Anti-crisis plan of government should simplify also work between employers and authorities. There are a lot of different actions in this plan. new reasons for temporary labor contracts will be allowed. Electronic workflow in the HR administration will be developed. Labor books, as Konstantin said. Labor contracts can be also can be an electronic form. Orders. It should be less audits from authorities, less reports from them, and so on. This summer, government is launching the pilot project of electronic workflow in HR administration for a certain set of companies. It will be the test, and I think probably Rusvinal will participate in this test. At least we have such kind of plans. And the last thing that I will mention will be labor code. The chapter of labor code regarding distant work will be revised to make it more practical. It will be allowed to combine distant work with regular work. Interaction with distant workers through communication channel will be more simple without special electronic signatures and so on. So thank you for your attention. It was last slide from my side.
Thank you, Igor. Well, we have a few minutes for some questions. So if some of you want to raise a hand or write in the chat to ask questions, you are welcome. Okay, I check here. I don't see anyone raising hands. Okay, maybe Arkady, I give you back the floor then.
No question. Well, it was a good presentation, so no question. All is done. Well, thank you to our guest speaker. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Konstantin. Thank you, Igor. Thank you, Mano, for your moderating. And dear friends, thank you for your presence and participation. If you like this session, which I believed, I give you appointment on July time 10, okay? And say you bye-bye and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.